She wasn't supposed to be there. A pastry chef in a borrowed uniform, standing in a room full of killers, holding a tray of chocolate eclair like a shield. And when the most feared man in Chicago walked through that door, blood dripping from his clenched fist, eyes scanning the room like a predator cataloging prey, he stopped. Not for the politicians, not for the generals of his empire. He stopped for her. And that was the moment Celine Ashcroft's ordinary life ended. If you're already hooked, good. Hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to hurt before it heals. Batted. The rain had been falling since 4 in the afternoon, the kind of rain that didn't care about us. Steady, cold, indifferent, hammering the windows of the Varelli Grand Hotel like it had a personal grievance against the city of Chicago. By 7:30, the streets below were black mirrors reflecting the amber smear of street lamps, and the hotel's loading dock smelled of wet concrete and diesel, and the faint sweetness of sugar glaze drifting from the catering van that Celine Ashcroft had been unloading for the past 40 minutes. She was sweating. That was the first thing anyone watching her would have noticed. Not her size, not the curve of her hips straining against the catering uniform's too tight black slacks, not the elaborate box braid she'd pinned up at 6 that morning before the mirror in her cramped Pilsen apartment. The sweat. Because Celine moved like someone who had long since stopped apologizing for the space she occupied and started simply working, which meant she moved faster than anyone expected and pushed harder than was strictly required and never, not once, stood still long enough for anyone to comment on her body without risking being run over by a cart of dessert trays. Celine. Marcus, the event coordinator, a thin, perpetually anxious man with a clipboard and the energy of someone who had consumed his body weight in espresso, materialized at her elbow. We have a problem. We always have a problem, Marcus. The Florentine tort. 3 of the 6 are showing structural collapse. They're not collapsing. They're settling. There's a difference. She set down the last crate of plated millefeuille without looking at him. Which 3? The ones near the van's left wheel well. Because you loaded them near the left wheel well. I specifically said... She stopped, breathed. This was not a battle worth the oxygen. Show me. What followed were 20 minutes of focused crisis management that Celine had become expert at over her 9 years in professional catering. A pastry brush here, a thin application of warmed ganache there, a light pass with a small offset spatula that transformed structural compromise into deliberate rustic texture. She worked quickly, her hands never hesitating, her expression one of pure concentration that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the fact that she genuinely loved this, the repair, the rescue, the transformation of a near disaster into something that looked intentional. Good? Marcus asked, hovering. It'll hold. Don't put anything heavy on the same shelf during transport up. She looked at the service elevator, already loaded. Also, whoever scheduled us for the South Freight elevator on a night with 6 simultaneous events running in this building needs to find a new career, Marcus. We waited 19 minutes. I know. 19 minutes where the chocolate work was in a 72-degree service corridor. Celine, I'm not complaining. I'm documenting. She snapped off her gloves. What floor is this event on? 43rd, private banquet suite, the Wentworth Room. Marcus lowered his voice, which was a thing he did when he was about to say something he'd decided she needed to know, but hadn't decided she needed to know fully. It's a private booking. Very private. The client's people handled the setup themselves. We're only catering the dessert and champagne service. Celine looked at him. Marcus, it's well compensated. That's not what I asked. He adjusted his clipboard. The booking is under a corporate account, Velantris Holdings. The name meant nothing to her. She pulled up the service cart, checked her uniform, and headed for the elevator. The 43rd floor of the Varelli Grand was a different atmosphere entirely. Quieter than quiet. The kind of silence that wasn't absence of sound so much as the presence of controlled space. The hallway outside the Wentworth Room had men in it who were not hotel staff. Celine noticed this immediately, the way she noticed most things about rooms before entering them. The slight bulk at the hip of the nearest man's jacket, the way his eyes tracked her cart without moving his head. The second man positioned further down the hall who was watching the elevator bank rather than the suite door. She'd seen security before. She'd catered enough corporate events and political fundraisers to know the difference between hired presence and operational presence. These men were operational. She presented her staff credentials without being asked because it was faster, and the man reviewed her ID with a professionalism that had no performance in it, thoroughness for its own sake, then waved her through. Inside the Wentworth room, the banquet was already underway. Maybe 30 people around a long table of dark wood and candlelight, the kind of gathering that looked at a glance like a board dinner and felt, on closer inspection, like something else. The suits were too expensive. The conversation was too low. The men who stood at intervals around the room's perimeter were too alert. Celine found the designated service area and began setting up. This was her natural state, visible through function, invisible through familiarity, the way all good service staff learned to exist at events where they were necessary but not acknowledged. She arranged the dessert presentation with the same focus she always brought, checking sight lines for the table reveal, adjusting the height of the champagne flutes, keeping her movements efficient and her expression neutral. She was arranging the last of the Florentine torts, the repaired ones, which looked better now than they had before the structural issue, honestly. When the suite's main door opened and the temperature in the room changed, it wasn't literal. The HVAC system didn't shift, but Celine felt it, that pressure wave of attention redirecting, all 30 guests and all 4 perimeter men orienting toward the entrance without appearing to, and she looked up from the dessert table because she was a person and people look when rooms change. The man who entered was not large in the way that announced itself. He was perhaps 6'2", lean in the way that suggested controlled use rather than gym performance, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than 3 months of Celine's rent. His face was... She found herself genuinely pausing on this, which was unlike her, striking in a way that had nothing to do with handsomeness and everything to do with precision, sharp angles. Dark eyes that moved across the room in a single sweep and cataloged everything in it. Everything except her, initially. He was speaking in low tones to a man at his right shoulder, older, gray-templed, watchful, and there was blood on his left cuff. Not a lot. A smear, already darkening at the edges. His right hand, she noticed, was wrapped loosely in what appeared to be a handkerchief, the white linen showing a bloom of deep red at the center. He'd been in a fight. Recently. And he had come here directly from it, which told her something about the kind of man he was, or the kind of room this was, that she wasn't certain she wanted to know. Celine looked back at her dessert arrangement. 2 minutes later, the catering coordinator from the hotel's side, a woman named Jess, who'd been assigned to interface between the catering team and the client, appeared at Celine's elbow and murmured, "They want the dessert service to begin now. Full table presentation. Mr. Varelli prefers the staff visible for service, not hovering in the staging area." Varelli. The name landed somewhere in Celine's chest before her brain had fully processed it. Because she was from Chicago, and you didn't live in Chicago. Not really live in it. In the neighborhoods, in the small restaurants and late-night conversations and overheard commuter conversations, without eventually building a vocabulary of names that existed in a specific register. Names you heard and felt rather than heard and understood. Cassian Varelli was one of those names. She kept her face neutral, picked up her serving tray, did her job. The table service required moving through the room, and moving through the room required proximity to guests who were used to service staff being furniture, which suited Celine fine. She moved along the far side of the table, setting plates with quiet efficiency, her eyes on the work. Her awareness distributed across the room the way it always was at events where she'd clocked potential tension. She was 3 seats from the head of the table when she heard the chair scrape. She didn't look up, but she was aware, the way you're aware of something large and quiet moving in a space that was previously still, of the man at the head of the table rising. He appeared at the edge of her peripheral vision and did not move past it. Celine placed the plate in front of the guest to her left and straightened because there was nothing else to do, and found Cassian Varelli standing approximately 4 feet away from her, watching her with an expression that she had no immediate category for. Not the assessment of an employer evaluating staff. Not the reflexive male inventory that she'd grown armor against years ago. Something else. Something more specific and therefore more unsettling. "The Florentine," he said. His voice was low, not performing itself. "You made this." It wasn't a question. She wasn't sure how he knew. She wasn't the only person on the catering team, but the certainty in his voice suggested he wasn't guessing. "I did," she said. "It was almost not on the table tonight. I was told there was a problem during transport." She met his eyes because she didn't look away when men spoke to her as though they expected her to. "There was. I fixed it." Something shifted in his expression, almost imperceptible, but she caught it. A fractional recalibration, like a scale that has just received unexpected weight. "Cassian," the gray-templed man appeared at his elbow. "We have business to—" In a moment. He didn't look away from Celine. "Your name." "Celine Ashcroft." "Ashcroft." He said it like he was putting it somewhere specific. "How long have you been with the catering company?" 6 years. "You enjoy it." Again, not a question. She felt the peculiarity of being read accurately by a stranger and chose irritation over flattery, which was her usual response. "I enjoy the work. Not always the hours." Something that was almost a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. "Fair answer." His eyes dropped briefly, not in the way that men's eyes sometimes dropped, inventory fashion, but in a way that seemed almost involuntary, like he'd caught himself. "You'll be here for the full service this evening?" "Until the dessert service is complete, probably another hour." He nodded, very slightly. The gray-templed man's jaw had tightened. Several people at the table had stopped pretending not to watch. Celine picked up her tray and continued down the table. She was in the staging area 15 minutes later, boxing up the remaining inventory, when Marcus appeared with a look she'd learned to interpret as the specific combination of nervousness and cautious good news. "The client has requested you personally for the remainder of the service." "I'm almost done with the remainder of the service. And also, they've asked if you're available for a private event next weekend." Celine stopped. "Marcus, the rate they're offering is—" He said a number. She stopped again, for different reasons. That was more than she made in a month. "Tell them I'll think about it." "Celine, I said I'll think about it." She finished sealing the box. "Who made the request?" "The coordinator, on behalf of Mr. Varelli." She didn't answer. She picked up the box and went back to work. The remainder of the service passed without further direct interaction. She was aware, she couldn't help being aware, of Cassian Varelli's attention tracking her at intervals. The way you become aware of a light source that isn't directly in your field of vision. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't what she would have called threatening. It was simply relentless, the way gravity is relentless. Not pushing, just present and operating at all times. When the service ended and she was loading the final carts, the gray-templed man appeared in the staging area doorway. His name was Rourke, she'd gathered from overheard fragments of conversation. He had the look of a man who had made a career of managing complications. "Mr. Varelli would like to speak with you before you leave. I have equipment to load. It will take 5 minutes." She considered the room behind him, the suite, now being cleared by staff, and the weight of what she knew about the name Cassian Varelli and what it meant in this city. And she thought about the number Marcus had said, and she picked up her jacket and followed Rourke. The main suite had mostly emptied. The table was being cleared by hotel staff, the candlelight already replaced by the flat brightness of overhead lights that stripped away the evening's careful atmosphere and revealed it for what it was. A rented room where something had been decided or finalized or arranged. Cassian stood near the windows, his jacket removed now, the blood-stained handkerchief replaced with a fresh wrapping on his right hand. He was looking at the rain-soaked city below. He turned when she entered. "Thank you for staying," he said. "I had a choice?" He didn't flinch from the directness. If anything, the corner of his mouth moved again. "You always have a choice. I don't force conversations." "Just everything else?" She hadn't meant to say it, but she'd been carrying the awareness of who this man was for the entire evening, and it had apparently found an exit. He looked at her for a long moment. "Sit down, Miss Ashcroft." "I'll stand." Another fractional pause. "All right." He moved to the window's edge, creating a different geometry in the room, and turned to face her properly. Without the table and the formal gathering between them, she registered this against her better judgment, more rather than less than his reputation. The stillness in him wasn't composure. It was the stillness of something that had learned not to move unnecessarily because unnecessary movement was a form of warning. And he preferred people not to have warnings. The event next weekend, he said. It's a private dinner, 12 guests. I'd want the dessert service handled entirely by you, not a team. A specific menu that I'll have my people coordinate with you in advance. That's not how the company operates. The company has already been contacted and has agreed in principle. The question is whether you agree. She felt the shape of this, the way the decision had been arranged around her before she was asked, which was either efficiency or something else entirely. What kind of private dinner? My home. Guess who value discretion? She looked at the wrapped hand, the ghost of a stain still visible at the cuff of his shirt. I'm sure they do. This time he didn't almost smile. He actually did, and it was more unsettling than the controlled version because it was unguarded, brief, and entirely genuine. You don't like me. I don't know you. You know enough to have formed an opinion. Doesn't everyone in Chicago? He turned back to the window for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost a layer of something. The professional register, maybe. What was underneath was quieter. You do extraordinary work. The detail in the presentation tonight. The way the ganache was applied on the torts. That's not technique. That's care. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected to feel anything about it, either. But accuracy lands differently than flattery, and what he'd said was accurate. I take my work seriously. So do I. He looked at her again. I would like to see what you could do with more time and proper resources. Is that what you're offering? Resources? Among other things, she held his gaze. Mr. Varelli, I have a life. I have a job that I've built carefully over 6 years, and a team I'm responsible for, and a date this Friday with someone I actually know. She picked up her jacket. I'll have Marcus send you a formal response about the private event. The change was subtle, but it was immediate. His eyes, which had been, she would struggle later to describe it, open in some way that was not their usual state, closed back down. Not with anger, with something more controlled and therefore more concerning. His gaze dropped to the hand holding her jacket and then back to her face. A date, he said. Friday, yes. With whom? She put on the jacket. That is genuinely not your business. Someone from the company? She looked at him. Good night, Mr. Varelli. She was at the suite door when she heard the sound, sharp, crystalline, a short and savage note that didn't belong in a room that was otherwise quiet. She turned. He was looking at his right hand. On the table beside him, the remains of a heavy crystal highball glass lay in fragments, glittering under the overhead lights. His palm was bleeding again, fresh red cutting through the older stain, the fresh wrapping already dark at the center. He hadn't thrown it. He'd crushed it. With his bare hand, standing still, barely moving. His eyes found hers across the room, and his voice, when it came, was very quiet, quieter than anything he'd said all evening, which made it worse. Whoever he is, Cassian said, whoever claims you, he'll disappear. The suite door was heavy. She got through it and didn't look back. The service elevator took 47 seconds to arrive, and Celine stood in front of it without moving, her jacket half-buttoned, her heart operating at a frequency that she recognized as fear, even as she kept her face perfectly still. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She had grown up in a household where her father's volatility had taught her to read rooms before entering them and to keep her own face as a controlled surface, presenting calm while everything else ran calculations underneath. What she was calculating now was this. The man in that room was not making a threat in the way that threats were usually made, with heat, with visible loss of control, with the need to see you flinch. He had said it the way you state a fact about weather or road conditions, dispassionately, as though it was information she was entitled to and he was simply providing it. That was worse. The elevator opened. She stepped inside and the doors closed, and she stared at her own reflection in the brushed steel panel, the pinned braids, the caterer's uniform, the expression that was still, and thought about the word disappear and what it meant in the grammar of a man like Cassian Varelli. Down in the loading dock, the rain was still falling. Marcus was waiting with the manifest, and the van needed loading, and there was an inventory reconciliation to complete before she could sleep. And on Friday, she was having dinner with Nathan Pierce, who had asked her 3 times before she said yes, and who was warm and funny and safe in the way that people who wanted something specific from you sometimes appeared to be. She loaded the van in silence. She did not mention to Marcus what had happened in the suite. She did not mention the broken glass. She signed the manifest and thanked the hotel's dock crew and got into the passenger seat and watched the city slide past the rain-streaked window as they drove back to Pilsen. And she kept her hands very still in her lap because they wanted to shake, and she had never, not once in her adult life, given her hands permission to shake in public. At home, alone in her kitchen at 11:43 at night with a cup of tea she'd made on autopilot and hadn't touched. She sat at the small table by the window and looked at the rain on the glass and thought about a man who could crush crystal with his bare hand and bleed on it and not look down. She thought about the way he'd said care when he described her ganache application and the specific accuracy of it, and the way that accuracy had felt like being seen rather than assessed. She thought about the phrase, "whoever claims you," and what it revealed about how a man like Cassian Varelli understood the world, arranged, possessed, claimed, and told herself it was reprehensible, which it was. She also thought, against her better judgment and with a clarity she wished she didn't have, that no one had ever said anything so specific about her work in 6 years of professional service. That the warmth in his eyes when he'd looked at her was not the warmth of a man performing appreciation. That the blood on his hand had not made her feel unsafe so much as it had made her feel, she hated this word, but there it was, seen. She drank her tea. It was cold. She was going on a date Friday with Nathan Pierce, who was normal and uncomplicated and had never once crushed anything in her presence. She went to bed. She didn't sleep until nearly 3. Friday arrived the way Fridays arrive when you've been dreading and anticipating something simultaneously, too quickly, and with terrible punctuality. Nathan Pierce was waiting outside the cafe on West Randolph at 7:15, wearing a jacket that he'd clearly chosen with some care and carrying an expression of confident ease that Celine had initially read as relaxed, and was now, for reasons she was still examining, reading as practiced. He was handsome in a conventional way, tall, square-jawed, the kind of face that photographed well and read as trustworthy in approximately the first 4 seconds of acquaintance. He'd come to Harvest Catering 8 months ago and had quickly become the person everyone gravitated toward in the break room, the one who remembered birthdays and brought coffee and knew how to ask questions that made you feel the conversation was about you. Celine had liked him. She still liked him, in the way you like someone before you've had occasion to discover who they actually are, under conditions that require revealing it. "You look amazing," he said, when she reached the cafe entrance. "Thanks." She did, actually. She'd worn the deep burgundy wrap dress she'd bought on impulse 6 months ago and not found occasion for. She'd unpinned her braids and let them fall, which took up space in a way she'd been taught to feel apologetic for and had spent years learning to simply inhabit. She inhabited them tonight. "Shall we go in?" The cafe was good, warm lighting, a menu that didn't take itself too seriously, a noise level that permitted conversation without requiring performance. They ordered. Nathan talked, and he was good at talking, the kind of easy forward motion that carries a conversation without requiring the other person to contribute much, which Celine noticed but initially attributed to nerves. It was 30 minutes before she recognized it as something else. "So the event last weekend," Nathan said, around the time the entrees arrived. He was casual about it, casually casual, which was its own register. "The one at the hotel, how was it?" Celine looked at her food. "Fine. Just a corporate booking." "I heard it was Virelli's people." She looked up. "Where did you hear that?" He shrugged, a very easy shrug. "Word gets around in the catering world." "Was it?" "Nathan." She set down her fork. "Why are you asking me about a client?" "Just conversation." A smile. "It's a big name. I'm curious." "Curious about the client or about what I saw?" The smile didn't waver, and that was the tell. The exact place where a genuine expression would have shifted and the practiced one held because it had been calibrated for exactly this kind of scrutiny. "Both, I guess. I mean, you spent the evening in the same room as—" "I'm a pastry chef. I spent the evening in a staging area and moving between a table and a service cart." She picked up her fork again. "There's nothing to tell." Nathan reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She let him. But something in her had gone still in a way that had nothing to do with the warmth of his hand and everything to do with the memory of a window with rain on it and a man asking her, quietly and for the second time, with whom. "I'm not trying to pry," Nathan said. You're connected to people, Celine, through the work. You see things. I thought maybe..." "Nathan," her voice was level. "We're on a first date." "Right, yeah." He withdrew his hand and picked up his wine. "Sorry, old habit. I ask too many questions." "What do you do again? Before catering? Nothing interesting?" "Quick, clean." The sentence arrived without hesitation, which meant it had been prepared. "Did I mention you look genuinely stunning tonight?" She let it go. She ate her food. She told herself the unease in her chest was projection, residue from Wednesday night, from the man with the broken glass and the bleeding hand, and the specific terrible quiet of his voice when he'd said disappear. She told herself Nathan was normal, and this was normal, and she was allowed to have a normal evening. She was 30 seconds from believing herself when the restaurant's front window went dark. Not dark, shadowed. A vehicle, large and black, had pulled against the curb directly outside, its headlights cutting through the glass and then extinguishing. Celine looked at it without meaning to, and then she looked at Nathan, and Nathan was looking at the vehicle, and his expression had changed. Not much, just a fractional tightening around the eyes that she would not have noticed if she hadn't spent her entire career learning to read rooms. He knew what that car was. The restaurant's front door opened. Cassian Varelli walked in without making a production of it. He'd have preferred not to be noticed, she thought distantly, watching him move toward the host stand. He had the carriage of a man who moved quickly through spaces and preferred exit points to entry points. But the room noticed him anyway, the way rooms notice things that alter their atmosphere, and by the time he'd crossed the floor toward her table, the couple next to them had stopped talking and the server who'd been approaching from the left had quietly redirected. He stopped at the edge of their table. He looked at Nathan's hand, which was resting near Celine's fork. He looked at Nathan. Then he looked at Celine with an expression she couldn't categorize and that she suspected he hadn't planned on having. "Ms. Ashcroft," he said. Nathan was on his feet, which was fast. Faster than the situation required, which meant he'd been ready. "Sir, I didn't expect..." "Sit down." Cassian didn't look at him, still looking at Celine. "I need a moment. We're in the middle of..." "Sit. Down." Nathan sat. Celine did not look away from Cassian. "You tracked me," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady, which cost her something. "I need to tell you something about the man you're having dinner with. We can have this conversation another..." "He's not a caterer." Cassian placed both hands flat on the table's edge. She noticed the right hand was wrapped again, clean dressing, and his voice dropped to a register that was private without being intimate. "His name is Nathan Pierce, and he is a federal agent who took a position at your company 6 months ago to build a case against my organization. He's been using your proximity to my events to gather intelligence." The table was quiet. Celine looked at Nathan. Nathan's face had done something complicated and resolved into an expression she'd seen before, in rooms where people had been caught and chosen to commit to the position they'd been caught in rather than concede it. "Celine, is it true?" she said. "Celine, whatever he's..." "Nathan." She said his name the way you say a word that has changed its meaning. "Is it true?" The silence was 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which Nathan Pierce calculated something, and Cassian Varelli stood without moving, and Celine sat in her burgundy dress with her hands flat on the table and would not, let her face do what it wanted to do. "It's complicated," Nathan said, which was, as answers went, the kind that contained the one she'd asked for. Celine stood up. She picked up her jacket from the back of her chair. She was aware of Cassian watching her, aware of the other tables watching, aware of the server who had materialized near the host stand and was making brief eye contact with the men who had come in after Cassian and positioned themselves near the entrance. She was aware of Nathan's hand closing around her wrist. "Celine, wait, just wait, this isn't..." He was standing, his composure cracking now, the practiced ease shearing off to reveal something underneath that was less rehearsed and more genuinely afraid. Not of her, of the man beside her. "Let me explain. I wasn't trying to hurt you. You were just..." "Let go of her wrist." Cassian's voice had not raised. It was the same volume it had been all evening, but Nathan let go of her wrist and took a step back with a speed that was not voluntary. Cassian looked at his hand, at Nathan, at the room's geometry, and something in his face, the controlled precision of it, the calibrated stillness, began to shift in a way that Celine recognized from Wednesday night, from the moment before crystal became fragments and blood became visible. And she understood with the clarity of an animal registering danger that she was about to watch something happen in this restaurant that she could not undo once she'd seen it. Mr. Varelli. Her voice came out steady. She didn't know how. Don't. He looked at her. Don't, she said again. And the room held its breath, and Cassian Varelli stood there with his eyes on the woman in the burgundy dress and whatever had been rising in him. The thing that crushed Crystal, the thing that made grown men step backward without being asked, receded by degrees that she could actually track, like water pulling back from a shore, slow and terrible and controlled. He reached past Nathan and picked up Celine's jacket from where she'd dropped it in the movement and held it toward her, wordlessly. She took it. My car is outside, he said. I'll drive you home. She looked at Nathan, who was standing very still, and she thought about his hand on hers and his easy questions and the practiced smile that hadn't shifted when it should have. She thought about the word complicated and everything it had contained. Then she looked at the man holding her jacket with a wrapped and bleeding hand and thought about all the reasons why this was an objectively terrible idea and how very aware she was of every single one of them. She put on her jacket. I'm not getting into your car to go home, she said. I'm getting into your car to find out exactly what is happening. That's not the same thing. Understood, Cassian said. And she walked out of the restaurant ahead of him into the rain-soaked Chicago night. And the last thing she heard before the door closed was Nathan Pierce beginning to speak, and Cassian's voice, very quiet, very level, saying two words that made Nathan stop immediately and completely, and she didn't catch what the words were, but she thought about them all the way to the curb, where the black car was waiting, and she got in, and the door closed behind her. And the city moved past the rain-streaked glass as they pulled into traffic. And somewhere behind her in a restaurant on West Randolph, a federal agent was sitting alone at a table for two, and Celine Ashcroft was alone in the back of an armored limousine with the most dangerous man in Chicago. And she still didn't know yet, not fully, not yet, what she was actually afraid of. Him or the way he'd looked at her when she'd said, don't, and he had listened. The limousine smelled like leather and cold air, and something underneath both of those things that Celine couldn't name. The specific atmosphere of a space where decisions had been made and not second-guessed. The seat was deep, and the windows were tinted so dark that Chicago outside was reduced to a smear of light and rain, and she sat with 3 feet of space between herself and Cassian Varelli, and kept her hands in her lap, and her breathing deliberate, and her mouth shut, because she was still running the calculation of what she'd just done, and she needed silence to finish it. He didn't fill the silence. She'd expected him to. Men like him, men who occupied rooms the way he occupied rooms with that particular gravitational certainty, tended to fill silences as a demonstration of control. He didn't. He sat with his wrapped hand resting on his knee and his eyes on the partition between them and the driver, and he waited. She spoke first. She'd known she would. Nathan Pierce. She said the name the way you say something you've picked up off the floor and aren't sure you want to hold. FBI. Organized Crime Task Force, Cassian said. Chicago Field Office. He's been embedded at Harvest Catering for 23 weeks. 23. The week after you catered the Meridian Club event in February. That event had 3 of my associates in attendance. She thought about February. Nathan arriving with his coffee offerings and his easy questions and his practiced warmth. 23 weeks of practiced warmth. How long have you known? 6 weeks. And you didn't eat? She stopped, rerouted. Why didn't you just have him removed? Something shifted in Cassian's expression, not toward softness, but toward precision, like a lens correcting focus. Because removing a federal agent from an operation creates paperwork. It creates interest. It creates a chain of events that is more disruptive than the surveillance itself, when the surveillance isn't producing anything of prosecutorial value. A pause. And because I needed to understand the full scope of the operation before I moved. And now you do. And now I do. The car moved through an intersection, and the rain intensified briefly against the roof, and Celine watched the water trace paths down the tinted glass and thought about 23 weeks of a man remembering her coffee order and asking her how her weekend was, and touching her hand across a restaurant table. He was going to use me, she said. Not a question, a thing being named. You were his access point, your professional proximity to my events, catering, private bookings, corporate functions. He was building a case around what you might overhear or observe or inadvertently document. A beat. You were never going to be harmed. He needed you functional and cooperative. That's supposed to make it better? No. He said it without apology, which was the right answer. It doesn't make it better. She looked at him directly for the first time since getting in the car. He met her gaze without adjustment, the way people do when they're used to being looked at with either fear or deference and have simply stopped modulating for either. What do you want from me? She said. Specifically, what does tonight cost? He looked at the wrapped hand on his knee. Nothing tonight costs you anything. That's not an answer. You're right. He turned toward her, slight shift of weight and attention that didn't feel like performance. I want you out of Pierce's operational radius. I want you somewhere I can ensure his operation doesn't find a way to use you as leverage. And I want to give you the full picture of what he's been doing so that you can make an informed decision about your own exposure. My exposure. She kept her voice level. You mean criminal exposure? I mean the exposure of being an unwitting participant in a federal investigation that is going to collapse badly when Pierce's supervisors discover that their embedded agent has been running a secondary agenda. She felt the shape of that, the phrase secondary agenda, and what it implied. He's not just building a case for the FBI. Cassian's jaw shifted. Barely. We're still verifying the full picture. That means no. That means I'm not going to tell you something I'm not certain of yet. She looked at the city sliding past the rain-dark glass. Take me home, Mr. Virelli. Celine, I heard what you said. I understand what you're telling me. I need to think, and I can't think in a moving car with... She stopped. Started again. Take me home. Please. The please cost her something, and she let it. Because it was honest and she'd rather be honest than perform composure she didn't fully have at this particular moment. He leaned forward and said something low to the partition, and the car's direction changed. He walked her to her building's entrance, which she hadn't asked for and didn't protest. The rain had thinned to a cold mist, and her breath made shapes in the November air, and she stood on her front steps with her key in her hand and looked at the man who had followed her to a restaurant and crushed a glass with his bare hand, and told her whoever wanted her would disappear, and she said, I'm not a thing that gets claimed. He stood in the mist with rain on his jacket and said, I know that. Then why did you say it? Wednesday night. What you said about whoever claims her. He was quiet for 4 full seconds. In those 4 seconds, Celine watched something move across his face that he didn't seem to know was visible. Not calculation, not management. Something raw and poorly sorted that a man like him probably hadn't had occasion to show often, if ever. Because I was not, he stopped, started differently. I don't lose things I want to protect. That's a character failing. I'm aware of it. It's a threat. That's what it is. Yes. No flinching, no softening. And I'm telling you so you understand I'm not going to pretend otherwise. She unlocked her door. Good night, Mr. Virelli. Cassian. She went inside. She did not sleep. She sat at her kitchen table from 11 until 2 and drank water she didn't want and ran through the past 6 months of Nathan Pierce in her mind with surgical attention, identifying the moments that should have registered differently, the questions that came too easily, the interest in her professional schedule that she'd read as attraction, the memory of him asking, 3 separate times and in 3 different framings, whether she'd had any contact with Virelli's private events coordinator. She told him no each time, which was true, and had thought nothing of it because he'd moved on smoothly, and she'd attributed the question to the same word-of-mouth curiosity that anyone working adjacent to Chicago's event circuit would have. She'd been useful to him. That was the anatomy of it. She'd been a useful piece of a larger structure that she'd had no view of, and he'd performed warmth and interest in the careful choreography of beginning to want someone in order to keep the piece positioned correctly. The specific cruelty of it was not the manipulation itself. She could process manipulation. She'd encountered it in various registers her entire professional life. The specific cruelty was the warmth. The warmth had been real enough to feel real. She'd believed it was real. And the gap between what she'd believed and what it actually was constituted a small and particular kind of humiliation that she was not going to let herself cry about at 2 a.m. in her own kitchen. She went to work the next morning with 3 hours of sleep and a container of cold brew and a face that gave nothing to the curious looks of her colleagues, several of whom had apparently heard something about the restaurant on Randolph. Chicago's event industry was a small world, and Nathan's absence that morning was noted without being discussed directly. He texted at 9:17. "I can explain. Can we talk?" She looked at the text for 30 seconds and typed back, "No." Then she blocked the number. Marcus found her at 10, in the prep kitchen where she was working through a wedding cake commission that wasn't due until Tuesday, but that she needed to be doing with her hands, because her hands knew what to do even when her brain was running separate concurrent processes. "Nathan called the main line," Marcus said. "Tell him I'm not available." "Celine, I mean it, Marcus. If he calls the main line again, tell him I've referred the matter to HR, and if he continues to contact staff of this company, he'll be hearing from our attorney." She applied a layer of Swiss meringue buttercream with precision that was slightly excessive for what the moment required. "I'll send you the formal language in an email." Marcus knew her well enough to leave. She was in the walk-in refrigerator at noon, checking the structural integrity of a tier she'd built the day before, when the door opened and the cold poured out around the man who filled the frame. Not Cassian. His man, Rourke, the gray-templed one, who moved through spaces with the efficiency of someone accustomed to arriving in places where he wasn't expected and making people immediately understand that his arrival was not the worst thing that could happen today. "Ms. Ashcroft." She turned around. "This is a commercial kitchen, Mr. Rourke. I'm aware. You can't just walk into a commercial kitchen. I showed your coordinator my credentials and explained this was urgent." She came out of the walk-in and let the door seal behind her. "What credentials?" "Private security. Mr. Varelli has retained me in an advisory capacity for your firm." She looked at him. "My firm? Harvest Catering was acquired this morning." A beat in which Rourke allowed this to land without assistance. "Through a holding company called Meridian Event Services. The acquisition is legal, properly documented, and will not affect your employment, your salary, or the operational structure of the company." Celine set down the spatula she was holding because she wanted something in her hand and then thought better of it. "He bought the company. The acquisition. He bought the company." She looked at the kitchen around her. Her kitchen, where she'd spent 6 years building something from prep cook to head pastry chef, and felt the specific nausea of something being rearranged beneath her feet without her permission. "So I work for him now." "You work for Harvest Catering, which continues to operate under its existing management structure." "Do not do that. Do not use that language with me." She turned to face Rourke directly, and whatever she was doing with her face was apparently effective because he adjusted his posture slightly. "Why?" "Mr. Varelli is concerned about Pierce's operational reach. While Nathan Pierce has been suspended pending internal review by his agency, his contacts within the rival organization he's been sharing intelligence with are not under any such constraint. This company was a point of vulnerability, so he bought it. He secured it, yes." She pulled off her pastry gloves, methodically, one finger at a time. "Tell Mr. Varelli that I would like a meeting, today, in person. And tell him that if he does not agree to that meeting, I will walk out of this building and retain an attorney and make things considerably more complicated for everyone involved." Rourke looked at her for a moment with an expression that she would later think of as professional respect reluctantly delivered. "I'll pass that along." The meeting happened at 4:30 in a private dining room at a restaurant in the West Loop that wasn't open to the public yet. Construction finished, furniture in, the particular hushed quality of a space that exists between versions of itself. Cassian was already there when she arrived, seated at the far table with a glass of water and a folder, and the same controlled stillness he carried everywhere. She sat across from him without being invited to. She put both hands on the table. "You bought my company," she said. "I secured an asset that was being used as an operational vulnerability." He met her eyes. "The acquisition protects you and your colleagues. It removes my autonomy. It changes the structure of your employment. Your autonomy is unchanged. Do not, she stopped, breathed. Do not make legal distinctions with me about things that are not legal distinctions in practice. You own where I work. That changes things. Everything about your compensation, your role, your creative authority over the kitchen program remains identical. I have no interest in running a catering company. Then why? Because Pierce wasn't working alone. He said it flatly. No preparation, no cushioning. The secondary agenda I mentioned last night, we have confirmation this morning. He has been feeding operational information, event schedules, client lists, staff movement, to an organization called the Drago Collective, a rival syndicate that has been trying to displace my operation for 14 months. He opened the folder and turned it toward her. These are the events he flagged for them. 4 of them involved you directly as service lead. She looked at the documents. She was not a person accustomed to looking at organized crime intelligence documents, which meant she was parsing them without context. But the event names were recognizable: the Meridian Club, the Varelli Grand, the private dinner she'd catered in September, and beside each one were dates and contact names and what appeared to be photographs. One of the photographs was her, standing outside the Meridian Club's loading dock at 6 in the morning with a cart of equipment taken from across the street with a long lens. She pushed the folder back slowly. He gave them my movements, she said. Sheree, your presence at those events marked them as Varelli adjacent in their operational mapping. You were, inadvertently, a geographic indicator. She sat with that. With the image of herself photographed without knowledge, her movements filed and categorized by people she'd never encountered, her ordinary professional life converted into data points in someone else's operational map. How dangerous is this? She said. For me, currently. Cassian was quiet for a moment that she recognized as genuine consideration rather than strategic delay. Pierce's suspension means the formal FBI operation is paused. The Drago Collective is not paused. They're aware that Pierce has been compromised, and they'll be moving to consolidate whatever intelligence he provided before it becomes cold. Which means the events you were present at are going to receive renewed attention, and you, as the most consistent staff presence at those events, may receive that attention as well. She looked at the table, at her own hands on it. So what do you want me to do? I want you to come to my estate for a period, under my protection, until this situation is resolved. She looked at him. I understand how that sounds, he said. Something in his voice had changed, shed one layer of the professional register, the way he'd done briefly on Wednesday night at the hotel window. I understand the full implication of what I'm asking, and I'm not asking it lightly. You would have full freedom of movement within the estate, your own space, your own work. I have a kitchen. Your salary continues. This is not a pause that cost him something. This is not what you're afraid it is. You don't know what I'm afraid of. I have a reasonable estimate. She looked at the photograph in the folder, herself, unaware, documented, and she thought about a rival syndicate that operated on intelligence provided by a man who had spent 23 weeks pretending to want her coffee order. How long? She said. Until the Drago operation is neutralized. Weeks, possibly less. And if I say no? He didn't look away. Then I'll have my security detail increased on your address and your workplace, and I'll do what I can from a distance. But the protection is significantly less effective and the risk to you is significantly higher. She looked at him for a long time, at the hands on the table, both of them, the wrapped one resting closer to the folder, the unwrapped one flat and still, at the face that was giving her the truth without packaging it and was clearly uncomfortable with the discomfort this caused her. I need to go home tonight, she said. I need to pack what I need. I need to call my sister and tell her I'm taking time away. And I need you to understand that if at any point I feel that this arrangement has shifted into something it isn't, I'm leaving, without discussion. Understood. And I want it in writing. The company, the acquisition, the terms of my employment, and the specific definition of my creative and operational authority. In writing from an attorney who is not yours. He looked at her with an expression that moved from surprise towards something else in the space of a single second. I'll have the documents prepared tonight. She stood up. She picked up her bag. She looked at the folder with her photograph in it still open on the table. What's going to happen to Nathan? She said. Cassian's jaw tightened. That depends on how much he's told them. That's not an answer. He held her gaze. He made a choice that put you at risk. The consequences of that choice are, don't. Her voice was flat. I don't want to know what you do to him. I'm asking because I don't want something to happen that I'll be legally implicated in. Nothing will happen that touches you. That's also not an answer. It's the one I can give you. She left the restaurant and walked 2 blocks in the cold before her legs decided they were done, pretending. And she stood in a West Loop doorway with her hand against the brick and her breath coming in short, controlled increments, running through what she'd just agreed to, the shape of it, the weight of it. She had agreed to go to the estate of the most dangerous man in Chicago because the alternative was a rival crime syndicate treating her professional schedule as a geographic map, and because the man asking her had bought her company to protect it and shown her documented evidence and told her the truth without softening it, and because somewhere under all of that was the persistent and unwelcome fact that she believed him, not his reputation, not his power, but the specific quality of his honesty in a room where he didn't have to be honest at all. She straightened up. She found her phone. She called her sister. I'm going to be away for a bit, she said. Work thing. Don't worry. Her sister, who knew her, said, Celine, I'm fine. You say that the exact way you said it when you had a fractured wrist for 2 weeks before you saw a doctor. I'll call you every day. Celine, every day, I promise. She looked at the street, at the Chicago night assembling itself around her. I have to go pack. She was at her apartment, standing in her bedroom doorway, looking at the suitcase she'd pulled from under the bed and not yet opened, when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Ms. Ashcroft. The voice was male, smooth, carrying the specific texture of someone who'd practiced sounding reasonable. My name isn't important right now. What's important is that you understand the situation you're about to walk into is considerably more dangerous than the man selling it to you would like you to believe. She stood very still. Who is this? Someone with information Nathan Pierce shared before his suspension. Specifically, a pause timed for effect. Information about why Cassian Varelli is really keeping you close, and it has nothing to do with protection. She looked at the open suitcase on her bed, at the phone in her hand, at the rain starting again against her apartment window. What do you want? She said. A conversation, tomorrow. Before you make a decision you can't walk back from. She thought about the photograph of herself outside the loading dock. She thought about 23 weeks of practiced warmth. She thought about Cassian in that restaurant, looking at Nathan's hand on her wrist and the quiet, controlled, terrible receding of whatever had been rising in him when she'd said, don't. She thought about all the reasons she had to trust no one in this particular situation and how that calculation was operating in direct conflict with every instinct she had. I'll think about it, she said, and ended the call, and stood in her bedroom with her empty suitcase open on the bed and the rain against the glass and the city outside doing what cities do, indifferent, continuous, offering no opinion on which version of danger she was choosing. She didn't call the number back. She stood in her bedroom for 11 minutes. She knew because she watched the clock on her nightstand with the specific focus of someone using an external fixed point to keep themselves anchored. And she turned the phone over in her hands and thought about the voice on the other end of it, the practiced reasonableness of it, the timing of it, arriving exactly when she was standing over an open suitcase making a decision that couldn't be unmade. Timing like that wasn't coincidence. Timing like that was operational. She put the phone face down on the dresser and packed the suitcase. She packed with the same precision she brought to everything that required her hands. Methodical, no wasted motion, the kind of packing that revealed what you actually needed versus what you thought you needed under stress. 3 weeks of clothing. Her pastry tools in their roll case, the good ones, the ones she'd bought herself piece by piece over 4 years. Her sister's photograph from the dresser top. The small sketchbook where she drafted plating concepts before she executed them. Nothing that couldn't be replaced. Nothing she couldn't carry herself. She zipped the suitcase at 11:47 and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the room she'd spent 4 years making hers. The deep green walls she'd painted herself 2 weekends after moving in. The shelves of cookbooks organized by region and then by year. The framed print above the desk that said nothing inspirational and was simply a mid-century botanical illustration of a vanilla orchid that she'd found at a market on Milwaukee Avenue and loved immediately for reasons she'd never fully articulated. She took the vanilla orchid print off the wall and wrapped it in a sweater and put it in the suitcase. Cassian's car arrived at 6 the next morning. Not Cassian. Rourke, who loaded her bag without comment and held the door and drove north out of the city in the early dark without conversation, which suited her. She watched Chicago give way to its own outskirts, the density thinning, the architecture changing registers from urban compression to the wider grammar of money that is chosen to not be seen. The estate emerged from behind a tree line 40 minutes north of the city. Not dramatically, not through gates that announce themselves, but gradually. The way something large reveals itself when you're already inside its perimeter before you've registered the perimeter exists. The house itself was stone and glass, set back from a private drive, surrounded by grounds that were maintained with the same controlled precision that characterized everything in Cassian Varelli's orbit. Rourke showed her to a suite on the East Wing's second floor. The room was larger than her Pilsen apartment's combined living and sleeping space. It had windows that looked over a kitchen garden that was dormant now, in November, but still geometrically perfect in its dormancy, each bed edged clean, the paths between them raked. It had a fireplace that was already burning low. The kitchen, Rourke said, is through the main hall and left. Mr. Varelli has asked me to let you know that you have full access and full authority in that space. The head of household staff will make herself available to you at whatever hour you require. Celine set her pastry roll on the desk. Where is he? He has business this morning. He'll be available this afternoon. She unpacked the vanilla orchid print and looked for somewhere to hang it and found a nail already in the wall above the desk, which was either coincidence or not, and hung it there, and stood back and looked at it and felt the specific disorientation of a familiar object in an unfamiliar context. She went to find the kitchen. It was extraordinary. She'd expected good. A man of Cassian's resources would have good. But this was beyond good in the specific way that revealed someone had thought carefully about what a kitchen was actually for rather than what it was supposed to signal. The equipment was professional grade without being performative. The workspace was generous. The light from the eastern windows at this hour was the particular quality of morning light that bakers knew and sought. Clean, directional, honest about color and texture in a way that overhead lighting never was. She stood in the center of it for a moment. Then she found the pantry and took stock of what was available and started working, because she was in a strange place and her hands knew what to do when she didn't. She was deep into the construction of a laminated dough, the repetitive, physical, satisfying work of folding butter into pastry, the process that required attention precise enough to displace other thinking, when she became aware that she was not alone in the kitchen. He was in the doorway. He'd come quietly, which was his way, and he was in a different register than she'd seen him before. No jacket, no tie, shirt open at the collar, the early morning light doing him no particular favors, and somehow making him more rather than less present because of it. The wound on his hand had a fresh dressing. He looked like a man who hadn't slept and wasn't advertising it. "You didn't have to start this morning," he said. "I work when I can't sleep." She turned the dough. "Is that a problem?" "No." He moved into the kitchen and sat at the island on the opposite side from where she was working, which preserved the width of the marble between them, which she recognized as deliberate. "What are you making?" "Couig naman, Breton pastry. It requires repetition. That's why I'm making it." He watched her hands, not in the way that felt like surveillance, in the way that felt like someone who found the mechanics of skilled work genuinely absorbing. "There's coffee," she said after a moment. "Your housekeeper put it on when she heard me moving around. It's on the stove." He got up and poured 2 cups without asking if she wanted one, and put one on the island within her reach and took his back to his seat. She picked it up without breaking the rhythm of the fold she was executing. They were quiet for a while. The kitchen was warm from the oven she'd preheated, and the fire in the adjacent sitting room that someone had started before she'd come down, and the rain from last night had given way to a gray November morning that pressed against the windows without committing to anything. "Someone called me last night," she said. His cup stopped. "After I got home. Unknown number, male voice. Said he had information that you were keeping me close for reasons other than protection. Said it was something Nathan told him." Cassian set down the cup. "What did he ask you to do?" "Meet him, before I came here. He called it a conversation I couldn't afford to miss." Did you agree? I packed my suitcase and got in your car this morning. What does that tell you? He was quiet for 3 seconds. It tells me you made a decision. A pause. But it doesn't tell me you believed me. She looked up from the dough. No, she said. It tells you I weighed my options and chose the one with better documentation. She looked back at the dough. I don't give trust that easily. You should know that going in. I know. Something in his voice had shifted. Not warmth exactly, but the absence of the professional layer. The thing underneath. It would concern me if you did. She folded the dough. Who called me? The voice. Did it have an accent? Any identifying characteristic? Smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that's been trained to sound reasonable. Eastern European inflection? She paused, replayed it in her memory. Possibly. Underneath the practiced part, yes. Cassian's jaw set in a way she was beginning to recognize as the external indicator of internal recalibration. That's Drago Collective. Specifically, it sounds like a man named Everin Kask, who handles their intelligence operations. He looked at the window. They move faster than I expected. Is that bad? It means they're not being cautious, which means they feel they're operating from strength. He looked at her. Tell me the exact words he used, as precisely as you can. She told him. All of it, verbatim as she could reconstruct it, including the phrase, why Cassian Varelli is really keeping you close. She watched his face while she talked, and his face gave her very little, which was its own kind of information. When she finished, he said, He told you it had nothing to do with protection. Yes. And you want to know if that's true. I want to know if there's a version of this where I'm useful to you in a way you haven't told me about. Because I've already experienced that with Nathan, and I have a very limited appetite for repetition. He looked at her directly. You're not operationally useful to me. You never were. Your proximity to my events was coincidental. Catering contracts. Nothing I arranged. What I've arranged since is a pause that seemed to cost him more than usual. Protective. That's the full extent of it. She searched his face for the practiced version of that answer and didn't find it, which wasn't conclusive but was something. Then what did Kask mean? He meant that he believes I have a personal interest in your well-being beyond the operational, and he intended to use that suggestion to destabilize your trust in me. A beat. He's not wrong about the personal interest. He is wrong about what I'm using it for. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went back to her dough. He stayed at the island and drank his coffee, and they didn't talk again for 40 minutes, and it was improbably one of the less uncomfortable silences she'd spent in recent memory. The afternoon changed things. Rourke came to the kitchen at 2 with an expression that he was managing carefully, which meant it wanted to be worse than what he was showing. Cassian was already reading it before Rourke spoke. Intel from Marsh, Rourke said. Marsh was the name she'd heard referenced twice in overheard phone calls. Someone internal, analytical, the person whose information Cassian seemed to weight most heavily. It's confirmed. Cassian set down what he was holding. Say it. Pierce isn't suspended. Rourke's eyes moved briefly to Celine and then back, which she noted. He was never under internal review. The suspension was a cover story his handler agreed to in order to give him room to maneuver. The room reconfigured itself around that sentence. He's still operational, Cassian said. More than operational. Rourke opened the tablet he was carrying and turned it toward Cassian. He's flipped. Formally. His arrangement with the Drago Collective has been upgraded. He's not feeding them intelligence anymore. He's embedded with them. Full defection from the FBI in exchange for protection and a percentage of whatever they take from us when the operation concludes. Cassian looked at this tablet for a long time without his expression changing and then put it face down on the counter and looked at the window. Pierce knows your safe protocols, he said to Rourke, but it was a thought being auditioned rather than a statement being made. He has the estate layout from the original security briefing when we were still... He stopped. When we believed he was an asset to be managed rather than turned. Celine put down the spatula she'd been holding. Nathan has the layout of this estate. Neither man answered, which was its own answer. He knows I'm here, she said. Rourke looked at Cassian. Cassian looked at her. He would have flagged your departure from your apartment this morning, yes. She pressed both hands flat on the counter. The marble was cold. She focused on the cold specifically, the physical fact of it, because the other facts in the room were moving faster than she could organize them. So I left the city to come somewhere safer, and I walked directly into the place that the person who already knows my movements has a map of. The estate's security protocols have been updated since the briefing Pierce attended, Rourke said. The outer perimeter, the access points. He's FBI, Celine said. Or was. He knows how security protocols work. He knows what gets updated and what gets assumed. She looked at Cassian. How compromised is this location? Cassian turned from the window. Something had changed in him. Not fear, she was certain it wasn't fear, but the shift of a man moving from one operational mode to a different and more serious one. Rourke, get Marsh on a live call. I want a full exposure assessment on what Pierce had access to during the original briefing. Already running it, and I want the perimeter doubled by nightfall. Change the rotation patterns. Nothing Pierce could have predicted from the original staffing schedule. Done. Rourke left. Celine looked at Cassian. Tell me what you're not saying. He looked back at her with an expression that was, she understood this about him now, the opposite of what it appeared. The more controlled it was, the more it was managing something underneath that he was choosing not to show because showing it would make it worse for someone in the room, and the someone in this case was her. Pierce's defection to the Drago Collective changes the calculus, he said. When he was an FBI agent running a secondary agenda, there were limits on what they could do. They needed deniability. They needed the operation to appear legitimate. A fully turned agent operating under Drago's protection has no such constraints. He paused. And he has a very specific motivation now. What motivation? You refused to meet Cass's contact last night. You came here instead. To the Drago Collective, that reads as you having chosen a side, which means you're no longer a neutral asset. You're a target, she said. A leverage point. The distinction matters. Does it? His jaw tightened. It means they want you functional, not eliminated. It means any approach they make will be... His phone rang. He looked at it. Something crossed his face that she'd never seen there before. Not fear, still not fear, but adjacent to it in the way that certain things are adjacent to other things without being them. He answered. Listened for 11 seconds. Said, how long ago? Listened again. Said, pull everyone back to the inner perimeter. Nothing moves in or out until I say so. He hung up and looked at her and said, Nathan Pierce was seen at the northern access road 40 minutes ago, on foot, armed. The kitchen was warm and the coffee was still on the stove, and the Queen Amman she'd put in to bake was making the room smell like caramelized butter and salt. And Celine Ashcroft stood in the center of it all and understood that the life she'd been living 2 days ago, the Pilsen apartment, the walk-in refrigerator, the date on West Randolph with a man whose warmth was a professional instrument, was completely and permanently gone, and that the woman who had believed she could step sideways out of this situation and retain her ordinary existence had been wrong in a way that could not be corrected. Cassian was already moving, speaking low into his phone, the professional register fully engaged now. Terse, precise, no wasted syllables. He stopped beside her and looked at her with that controlled face and said, Stay in the kitchen. Do not go near the windows. Rourke will be with you in under 2 minutes. Where are you going? To do what I do. Cassian, he stopped at the kitchen doorway and looked back, and for 1 second, one unguarded second that she would keep, his face showed her the man underneath the machine, the one who had sat at her island and drank coffee in the early morning and watched her hands fold dough with something that was not performance and not strategy and not the management of a useful asset. Then it closed back down. Lock the door after Rourke comes in, he said, and was gone. Outside, the November dark was coming early, and somewhere on the northern access road, a man who had spent 23 weeks pretending to want her was moving through the trees toward the house. And Celine stood in the warm kitchen with the smell of caramelizing sugar around her, and her hands finally shaking, and she let them, because Rourke wasn't here yet and no one was watching, and she pressed them flat against the cold marble and breathed. And outside, the first sound came, not close but not far, that she recognized, despite having never heard it outside a film before, as a gunshot. The first shot was followed by silence, and then by 3 more in rapid succession. And the silence between them was worse than the sound because the sound at least told you something was happening, and the silence told you nothing except that something had stopped. Rourke came through the kitchen door 40 seconds after Cassian left. He was moving fast, and his jacket was open, and his hand was at his hip, and his face had shed every layer of professional management and was operating on something older and more direct. He locked the door behind him, deadbolt, then the secondary latch, and moved to the windows and dropped the interior shutters on each one, heavy steel panels that descended with a sound like finality. "Stay low," he said, "away from the exterior walls." Celine had already moved to the interior corner between the island and the pantry entrance, which put 2 structural walls and a large block of marble between her and the house's exterior. She'd done it without being told, operating on an instinct she hadn't known she had until it activated. "How many?" "Unknown yet. Perimeter team is engaging at the north and east access points." Rourke positioned himself beside the kitchen's interior door, which led to the main hall. His weapon was in his hand now. She registered it without flinching, which surprised her. "Marsh has eyes on 6 confirmed hostiles, possibly more in the tree line. Pierce, not confirmed on perimeter yet." "He knows this kitchen," she said. "He knows the layout. If he knows where the safe room is, he knows the route." Rourke looked at her. "You read the briefing." "You left the tablet on the counter." She kept her voice level. "There's a bunker accessed through the east corridor, behind the library panel. That's where we're going, on my signal." The sound of the estate changed. She felt it before she fully heard it. A shift in the building's acoustics, the way a structure communicates what's happening inside it through vibration and altered resonance. Something heavy had happened in the north wing. Then voices, brief and operational, and then a sustained exchange of sound that she now understood was gunfire moving closer. "Now," Rourke said, and she was moving. The main hall was a different world from the warm kitchen, marble floors and high ceilings, and the chandelier above it casting hard light on a space that had become operational, 2 of Cassian's men moving fast through the far end, a third positioned at the main staircase with a weapon trained up. Rourke kept his body between Celine and the north-facing walls and moved her toward the east corridor with a hand at her shoulder blade that was directive without being rough. She heard Cassian before she saw him. His voice cut through the hall from the north wing entrance, not raised, not panicked, but carrying the specific authority of someone whose instructions were being followed in real time. He appeared at the corridor junction 30 feet ahead of them, moving toward the east passage. And when he saw Celine, his pace didn't change, but something in his face did. A fractional loosening, quickly controlled. "Library," he said to Rourke. "On it." Cassian fell into step on Celine's other side, and they moved as a unit through the east corridor, which was narrow and dark. The overhead lights either off or disabled, only the emergency strips along the baseboard throwing a low, red-tinged light across the floor. The carpet muffled their footsteps. The sounds of the estate were muffled here too, reduced to a series of distant concussions that she felt in her chest more than heard. "How bad?" she said. "Contained so far." His voice was absolutely even. She didn't believe the evenness, but she respected its function. 6-man team on the north access. We've neutralized 3. 2 more are moving toward the east wing. A pause that carried operational weight. Drago sent a serious team. Pierce led them in. Through the drainage access on the north side, which was in the original security briefing. His jaw. Yes. The library was at the end of the corridor. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, a reading table she'd noticed on her first tour of the house, and thought immediately that she'd want to work at. Rourke was already at the far shelf, his fingers moving along a specific sequence of book spines that weren't books, and a section of shelving swung inward on a hydraulic hinge to reveal a steel door behind it. "Code," Rourke said. Cassian stepped forward and entered an 8-digit sequence on the panel beside the door. The steel panel released with a pressurized hiss and opened onto a staircase going down. "Get inside," Cassian said to her. She went. The staircase was short, 12 steps, and the space at the bottom was larger than the word bunker suggested. A room maybe 30 feet square, climate-controlled, with a bank of monitors along one wall showing camera feeds from around the estate's exterior, a communications station, a medical kit, water and provisions sealed in climate cabinets, and furniture that was utilitarian but not uncomfortable. The monitors showed her, in the grainy green-tinged clarity of night vision, what was happening on the grounds above. She stood in front of the monitor bank and looked. There were men in the tree line, moving in coordinated patterns that she didn't have the vocabulary to name but could recognize as purposeful, not random, not desperate, but directed. On the north camera, 2 of Cassian's security team were down. She looked at this fact directly, and then put it somewhere she could process later because processing it now would cost her something she needed. Cassian came down the stairs behind her. Then Rourke. The steel door sealed above them. "Marsh," Cassian said to Rourke, who was already at the communication station. "Live in 10 seconds. Cassian stood beside Celine and looked at the monitors. She was watching the east camera, a figure moving along the exterior wall of the house, close to it, using it for cover. The figure moved differently from the tactical team in the tree line, less coordinated, more individual. "That's him," she said. Cassian looked at the monitor she was looking at. "That's Nathan," she said. "The way he moves, that's the right shoulder drops when he's trying to be quiet. I noticed it in the walk-in at work when he'd come in to—" She stopped. "That's him." Cassian's face did the thing she'd learned to read, the closing down of expression as the internal temperature rose. He turned to Rourke. "East exterior. Single hostile, identified as Pierce. Don't engage until he's away from the structural wall." "Copy." "He's going for the drainage access on the east side," Cassian said, mostly to himself. "He knows the secondary exit from the bunker runs." He stopped and looked at her and made a decision. "The bunker has a secondary exit that Pierce knows about. We're not staying here." "Where?" "Secondary vehicle bay. Underground level. 40 meters from this room through a connecting passage." She looked at the steel door above the stairs. "What's between us and the passage?" "Nothing yet. How long before nothing becomes something?" "Not long." He was already moving to the medical cabinet, pulling a kit, checking contents with the speed of someone who knew what he was looking for. There was a dark stain on his left side that she hadn't seen in the corridor's low light, but that was visible now under the bunker's overhead fluorescence. She looked at it. "You're hit," she said, "by through and through, left side. It's managed." "That is not managed." She crossed the room. He started to redirect her, and she looked at him with an expression that apparently communicated something absolute because he stopped redirecting and let her take the kit from him. She opened it, found the gauze, the compression wrap, the trauma clamp. "Sit down." "Celine." "Sit. Down." He sat. She lifted his shirt and looked at the wound. Entry and exit, left side above the hip. The exit wound worse, as they always were, but missing anything immediately catastrophic. She packed it with practiced hands, which was a strange thing to have. Practiced hands for a gunshot wound, but 9 years of professional kitchens meant she'd dealt with burns and cuts and knife injuries of a severity that most people never encountered, and the mechanics of pressure and packing transferred. "You've done this before," he said, watching her hands. "Not this specifically." She applied the compression wrap. "Hold this." She put his hand over the gauze and watched him hold it without wincing, which cost him something she could see in the set of his jaw. "How are you actually?" "Functional." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. From this angle, in this light, she was close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes that the controlled expression usually erased. "I've been worse," he said. It was, she thought, the most honest thing he could offer at this particular moment, and she accepted it. She closed the kit. "Now what?" He stood, carefully, and the careful was the only concession he made to the wound. "Now we move." The connecting passage was exactly what it sounded like. A corridor cut through the building's foundation, concrete and utilitarian, running west from the bunker toward the vehicle bay. Rourke led, then Celine, then Cassian behind her, and the passage was lit by the same low red emergency strips as the east corridor, and their footsteps on the concrete were louder than she wanted. They were 20 feet from the vehicle bay door when the passage lights went out entirely. Not the emergency strips, all of it, total dark. Celine stopped walking because she had to. She felt Cassian's hand at her shoulders, not gripping, just present, orienting, and heard Rourke somewhere ahead doing something with the door panel. "Generator's been cut," Rourke said. His voice was very controlled. "Manual override on the door. Give me 45 seconds. I'll shoot." They stood in the dark for 45 seconds, and Celine breathed and counted and kept her eyes open, though there was nothing to see, and felt Cassian's hand at her shoulder and felt it the same way she'd felt the cold marble under her palms in the kitchen, as a physical fact to anchor to while everything else moved. Light came back, partial, from Rourke's tactical light attached to his weapon, sweeping the passage ahead. The vehicle bay door opened. The bay was below grade, accessed by a vehicle ramp that rose to a gate at ground level. 3 vehicles, dark and armored. Rourke moved to the nearest and pulled the driver's door, while Cassian directed Celine to the rear passenger side, and she got in and the door sealed with that particular muffled thud of heavily reinforced panels, and for a moment she was in a bubble of near silence, while outside the bay Cassian and Rourke spoke in low, urgent tones she could see but not hear through the glass. On the monitor visible from her seat, a small screen in the rear console showing exterior camera feeds, she watched the estate above her in night vision green. She saw Nathan Pierce. He was at the bunker's secondary exit, which was a ground-level panel in the east garden, and he had it open, and he was looking at the empty space below it, the space where she was supposed to be. And his face in the night vision green was doing something that she had no framework for until she recognized it. Relief. He was relieved. Not that he'd lost her, relieved that the bunker was empty, that whatever was supposed to happen there hadn't. She sat with that for 3 seconds. Then he looked up at the camera. Directly at it, the specific posture of someone who knows where a camera is because they helped plan the security system. And his face changed from relief to something she could only describe as deliberate, and he spoke to someone off camera, and 3 men appeared from the east tree line and moved toward the house's east entrance. The rear passenger door opened. Cassian got in. Rourke started the vehicle. "Wait," Celine said. "We need to move." Nathan looked relieved that the bunker was empty. She kept her eyes on the rear console monitor. "He didn't look like he was trying to find us. He looked like he was confirming we weren't there." Cassian looked at the monitor, at Nathan's receding figure on the screen. "Say that again." He opened the secondary exit and looked down in his face. He was glad we were gone. "He's not directing the team toward the vehicle bay. They're going into the house." She looked at Cassian. "What's in the house that matters more than us?" The answer came across his face in pieces, and each piece was worse than the one before it. "The documents," he said. "Marcia's full intelligence package. I had it pulled from the server and printed for the briefing this morning. It's in the study." "What's in the package?" "Everything we have on the Drago Collective's Chicago operation. Every name, every financial instrument, every account number, the full structure." A pause that was 3 seconds of recalibration happening at speed. "If Pierce gets those documents to Drago before we can secure them, they can dismantle every operation they're currently running and reconstruct under new identities. We lose everything we've built over 14 months. Can you remote destroy the documents? The server? The printed copies can't be remote destroyed." She looked at the monitor. Nathan and his team disappearing into the east entrance. "How long do they have before they find the study?" "The study is on the 2nd floor, north wing, 6 minutes from the east entrance if they know the layout." He looked at her. "Pierce knows the layout. So 4 minutes?" 3. Rourke from the front. "We drive. Now. We cannot—" "The documents," Cassian said to Rourke, with an absolute stillness in his voice that was not calm and not panic, but something that had moved through both of those things and come out the other side. "If Drago gets those documents, we don't just lose 14 months. We lose the testimony of everyone we've placed inside their organization. We lose our people." The vehicle bay was silent, except for the engine idling. Celine looked at the monitor, at the house above, at the east entrance where Nathan Pierce had gone in 3 minutes ago. "I know the house," she said. Both men looked at her. "I've been here since this morning. I walked it this afternoon. The full floor plan. I know where the north wing stairs are, and I know the secondary service entrance on the south side that Pierce won't know about because it wasn't in the security briefing. It's a staff access." She looked at Cassian. "How many men do you have in the house right now?" 2, holding the main staircase. So 2 men holding one route and Pierce's team using the other route. And the documents are on the 2nd floor with nobody between Pierce and them except a staircase in 2 minutes. She held Cassian's eyes. "Or there's a service entrance on the south side." "Celine." His voice had something in it she'd never heard there before. "No. I'm not asking you. I'm telling you what I see." She looked at the monitor. "I'm not doing this because I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because those are your people's names in that package, and I am not going to sit in an armored car while You're not trained. I don't need to be trained to open a door and tell your men where to go. She held the door handle. Service entrance, south side. How do I access it from inside? He looked at her for 2 full seconds. It was, she would think later, the longest she'd ever seen him pause on anything. Rourke, he said. Rourke was already getting out of the driver's seat. No, she said. Rourke stays with you? You're bleeding and I'm not leaving you in a vehicle alone. I don't need 2 minutes, she said. I'm not arguing about this. He reached across and opened the glove compartment and took out a small radio and handed it to her. His hand closed around hers for 1 second. Not the claiming she'd feared, not the possession, just a hand around a hand, and then released. South side. There's a wooden panel in the south garden wall, painted gray, combination lock. 7412. Takes you into the service corridor. Corridor runs north, 3rd door on the left is the staff staircase. 2nd floor, turn right, study is 4th door. His voice was absolutely controlled and his eyes were not. Radio channel 4, keep it open. She got out of the car. The south garden was cold and dark and smelled of wet earth and the remnants of the rain from last night. And she ran through it in the dark without a light, because a light was a visible thing, and she was trying very hard to be an invisible thing. Her breath made shapes in the cold air. Her shoes were not made for running across wet grass, but she ran anyway, and the wet soaked through immediately, and her feet went cold and she ran anyway. The gray panel was exactly where he said. Her fingers found the combination lock by feel. 7, 4, 1, 2. And the panel swung inward on silent hinges. The service corridor was narrow and dim with the same red emergency lighting. She pressed the radio button. I'm in, she said, barely above a whisper. His voice came back immediately, low and steady. 3rd door left. She moved. The staff staircase was uncarpeted, concrete, same as the passage below. And she went up it with her hand on the railing and her heart working at a rate that she felt in her throat and her temples and the palms of her hands. 2nd floor. Right turn. Long corridor, darker than below. The overhead lights cut here too. 1 door, 2 doors, 3 doors. She heard footsteps on the other side of the 4th door. Not her footsteps. Footsteps from inside the study, moving with the purposeful character of someone searching rather than someone who has found. She pressed the radio. They're in the study, still searching. Static. Then Cassian's voice, different now. Moving, she could hear it. Hold position. My men are 60 seconds out from the main staircase. They don't have 60 seconds? Celine! She pushed the study door open. The room was lit by flashlight. 2 beams moving across shelves and the central desk, catching the edges of books and the face of a man she didn't recognize near the far window, and Nathan Pierce standing directly in front of the desk with a folder in his hands, turning toward the sound of the door, and his face in the flashlight crossing it doing something she had not prepared herself for. He recognized her. Of course he did. And what moved across his face in the first second was genuine. She would swear to it, something that was almost regret. And then it closed down, and he straightened and held the folder and looked at her in the study doorway with the radio in one hand and no weapon and no plan beyond this moment. Celine, he said. His voice was the voice from the restaurant, the practiced voice, the warm one. You should not be here. Put the folder down, Nathan. He almost smiled. The almost was the worst part. You drove here in his car and now you're running errands for him. Do you understand what you've... Put it down. He's using you. The almost smile was gone. What was underneath it was harder and less rehearsed and somehow more real than anything she'd seen from him in 23 weeks. I know you think what I did was worse, but what he's doing, keeping you here, making you feel protected, making you feel seen, that's a longer game than what I was playing, and the end result for you is the same. The difference, she said, is that he told me the truth, every time. She kept her eyes on his. You never did. Something in Nathan's face broke slightly. Not much. A hairline fracture in the performance. I wasn't given a choice about... Everyone has a choice. That's the only thing I know for certain right now. She held the radio up. I have 12 men on a channel who know exactly where you are. Put the folder on the desk. He looked at her, at the radio, at the man near the window who was looking at Nathan for direction. And then Nathan Pierce did something she hadn't anticipated in any of her calculations. He crossed the room in 4 steps and put his hand around her wrist. The same hand as the restaurant. And the specific repetition of it ignited something in Celine Ashcroft that wasn't fear and wasn't strategy, but was simply, cleanly rage. And he said, very quietly, close enough that she could see the calculation in his eyes behind the practiced warmth, "Tell him you need more time." She looked at his hand on her wrist. She pressed the transmit button on the radio. She said, "4th door, 2nd floor, north wing. Now." Nathan's grip tightened. He pulled the radio from her hand and threw it at the wall, and it shattered, and the study door behind her burst open with a force that rattled the shelving, and the man near the window shouted something, and in the chaos of the next 4 seconds, the door, the shouting, the flashlight beams swinging across the ceiling, Nathan Pierce pulled her in front of him with her back to his chest, and the cold circular pressure of a weapon at her temple, and the 2 men from Cassian's security who had come through the door stopped moving. The room went still, and Nathan said into the stillness, "Get Varelli on the phone, now, or I decorate his study with the only thing he actually cares about protecting." Celine stood in the circle of his arm with the weapon at her temple and her breath very steady. She was controlling it deliberately, in and out, because if she lost her breath, she lost everything, and looked at the 2 men across the room and saw in their faces the specific calculation of men who had not been trained for a scenario where the asset they were protecting had walked directly into the center of the problem. And then, from the corridor outside the open study door, came a sound she recognized. Not a gunshot, not a shout. Footsteps. A particular kind of footsteps, unhurried, deliberate, carrying the weight of a man who had moved through worse rooms than this and had not been stopped by any of them. The doorway filled. Cassian Varelli stood in it with blood dark at his left side, and his eyes moving from Celine's face to Nathan's hand to the weapon to the point of contact at her temple, and his face was, there was no other word for it, not in any register she had, terrible in the precise, original meaning of the word. A thing that inspired terror not through noise or size or performance, but through absolute, total, irrevocable certainty. "Let her go," he said. Nathan's arm tightened. "You're bleeding out, Cassian. I can see it from here. Put your weapon down and—" "Nathan." Cassian stepped into the room. 1 step, unhurried. "I'm going to give you 1 sentence to make a decision with. The sentence is this." His eyes moved to Celine's for 1 second, 1. And what was in them was not strategy and not management, and not the controlled precision she'd cataloged across 4 days of proximity. It was simpler than any of that, and therefore more frightening to witness. "Take the weapon away from her head." The room held its breath. Nathan's arm tightened further, and Celine felt the pressure at her temple increase, and she looked at Cassian across the room and thought about a kitchen and cold coffee and laminated dough and a vanilla orchid print on a wall, and she made a decision that was not rational and was not safe and was the most purely instinctive thing she had done in her adult life. She dropped. Not backward, not sideways, straight down, folding at the knees without warning, her full weight surrendering to gravity, and Nathan's arm lost its anchor and the weapon's angle shifted upward away from her head, and she hit the study floor hard on both knees and the room erupted. She hit the floor and the room came apart. The sound was immediate and total. Not the cinematic single shot of something choreographed, but the overlapping chaotic percussion of a space where multiple things happened in the same 2 seconds, and none of them waited for the others. She felt the concussion of it more than heard the individual components, her cheek against the study's hardwood floor, her hands flat, the specific cold of the wood against her palms, the most real thing available to her in that moment. She did not look up for 3 seconds. She counted them. On 4, she raised her head. Nathan was against the far wall, not standing. The impact of Cassian crossing the room had taken him off his feet, and the weapon was no longer in his hand, and Cassian was between them, facing Nathan, his left side dark with the blood from the wound she'd packed 40 minutes ago in another version of this evening. The 2 security men had the second hostile, the man from the window, face down on the floor with his hands secured behind him with the kind of practiced speed that meant this was not the first time they had done this. Cassian was breathing hard. She could see it from the floor. The controlled rise and fall of it, too controlled, the specific rhythm of someone managing pain through mechanical discipline. Nathan was looking past him, at her. "Get up," Cassian said. To Nathan. His voice was, she had never heard this register from him. Stripped of everything. No management, no precision, no professional architecture. Just the thing underneath all of it, which was old and had no patience left in it. "Get up." Nathan got up slowly, using the wall. His face had lost the practiced warmth permanently now. It was gone, and she didn't think it was coming back. Not because he'd been caught, but because whatever sustained that performance had been exhausted. What was left was younger than she'd expected. Raw. A man who had made a sequence of choices that had compounded beyond his capacity to manage, and was now standing inside the consequences of them. "It didn't have to," Nathan started. "Don't." Cassian said it the way you say something when you mean it to be the last word on a subject. "Whatever you're about to say. Don't." Nathan closed his mouth. One of the security men said something into his radio, and the response came back in a terse burst. Cassian heard it, and some of the rigid maintenance in his posture shifted, not relaxing, but recalibrating, the way a structure shifts when a load it was bearing is removed. "The North team?" Celine said from the floor. Cassian turned and looked at her. His expression when he saw her still on the floor did something complicated and resolved into the specific controlled alarm of a man who does not express alarm and therefore has no smooth way of showing it. He crossed the room and came down to one knee beside her, which was not a thing she'd expected from him and which affected her in ways she was too tired to organize. "Are you hurt?" "My knees." She looked at them. Both had taken the impact hard, the fabric torn, blood dark at both contact points. "I'm fine. Are you—" She looked at his side. The compression wrap she'd applied was visible through his torn shirt, and it was no longer doing what compression wraps do when they're working. "Cassian?" "I know." That's not—" "I know." He put a hand under her elbow and helped her stand, and then did not remove the hand immediately, and she let him not remove it because her knees were registering their objection to the floor with considerable emphasis. "Rourke has a medic on the perimeter team. We're done here." "The documents." He looked at Nathan, who was now in the custody of both security men, his hands secured. Then he looked at the desk where the folder had fallen when Nathan dropped it during the room's eruption. He crossed to it and picked it up without opening it and held it with the same care he'd held everything she'd seen him handle. Complete, unsentimental attention. "Intact," he said. She nodded. Her knees hurt, and the study smelled of gunpowder and the cold air coming through the window that someone had cracked before she arrived, and she stood in the middle of it and felt the specific exhaustion that comes not from physical exertion alone, but from the sustained expenditure of nerve across too many hours, the kind that goes into your bones. They took Nathan downstairs. She watched it happen and felt nothing she could immediately name. Not satisfaction, not grief, not the particular complicated sorrow of a betrayal fully revealed, because that had already happened in a restaurant on West Randolph when he'd said complicated and she'd understood what it contained. What she felt now watching them walk him through the East Corridor was closer to the feeling after a storm, when the air is altered and the ground is wet, and everything is still, and you are still in it. And that, in itself, is the complete fact. The medic worked on Cassian in the main hall, properly this time, with field surgical tools that made Celine look away, not from squeamishness, but from something she wasn't prepared to examine in her current state. She sat on the bottom step of the main staircase with her torn knees and a blanket someone had produced from somewhere and watched the house settle around her. The perimeter team reported in stages. The North assault was fully neutralized. 2 of Cassian's men had been injured, neither critically, which was a fact that Celine registered and filed with something she identified belatedly as genuine relief, the relief of a person who has begun to have stakes in outcomes she didn't choose. The Drago team had retreated before the perimeter could complete the containment, which Rourke described to Cassian in clipped operational language that she followed well enough to understand meant, some of them got away, and that had consequences, but not tonight's consequences. Nathan sat in a chair in the study under guard and said nothing to anyone for the rest of the night, which was a different Nathan than the one who'd spent 23 weeks filling every silence with practiced ease, and the difference was, in its own way, a kind of honesty. At some point, she'd lost precise track of the hour, somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, the house became quiet in the way that follows a prolonged state of not quiet. A a silence that was aware of itself and therefore not entirely restful. Celine was still on the stairs when Cassian came and sat beside her. He moved carefully. The medic had done what could be done in the field, and the rest would wait for a hospital in the morning. And he sat one step below her, so their eye line was nearly level, which was either practical or deliberate, and she didn't ask which. They sat for a while without talking. "You dropped," he said finally. "Yes." "Without any signal. Without—" He stopped. "I didn't know you were going to do that." "I didn't know either." She looked at her hands in her lap. It seemed like the thing to do. He was quiet for a moment. It was exactly the thing to do. "I know." She looked at him. "I made a choice. That's what I told Nathan. Everyone has a choice." A pause. "I chose." He held her gaze and she let him. And something passed between them. In that held gaze that was too large and too specifically weighted for her to reduce to a word, so she didn't try. "Your knees," he said. "They'll heal. The medic can—" In the morning. She looked at the house around them, the marble floors with their evidence of the night, the east corridor's dark mouth, the chandelier above the main hall that was somehow still burning, indifferent and constant. "What happens to Nathan?" Cassian looked at the study door, closed now, guarded. "His defection from federal service is documented. The intelligence he passed to Drago is documented. Marsh has the financial trail, every payment, every communication. By the time the relevant federal agencies convene, the case against him will be— He paused. "Complete. He goes to prison. For a long time." "Yes." "And Drago?" "The documents are intact. 14 months of intelligence, with Nathan's full cooperation, which he'll provide, because it's the only leverage he has left. We'll have enough to take the Drago Collective's Chicago operation apart at the structural level." He said it without satisfaction, which she found herself respecting. "It won't be clean, it won't be fast, but it will be finished." She nodded slowly. "And me?" He looked at her directly. "What about you? My company? The acquisition? The terms I asked for?" "The documents were prepared yesterday afternoon. Your attorney received them this morning." He paused. "Your attorney, not mine, as requested." She almost smiled. "I haven't read them yet." "No, you've been somewhat occupied." She looked at her hands. "I want to go back to work." "You can go back to work. Real work. Not—" "I don't want to be managed, Cassian. I don't want what I build to be built for me." She looked at him and said it clearly because she needed it to be clear. "I'm not interested in being something that belongs to your world. I'm interested in building something that belongs to me." He met her eyes and held them and said, "I know the difference." "Do you?" "I bought your company to protect it, not to own it. There is a distinction and I intend to honor it." She looked at him for a long moment, at the controlled face that was less controlled than usual at this hour, with this much of the night behind them, at the lines around his eyes, and the careful way he was holding himself against the pain from his side, and the specific quality of his attention to her that she had been measuring and cataloging across 5 days, and that had not once, not in any iteration she could identify, felt like inventory. "You said the first night," she said, "at the hotel, that whoever claimed me would disappear." She watched his face. "I've thought about that a lot." "I know." No evasion. It was the wrong word, the wrong framework entirely. "Yes, I've operated from a specific understanding of how things work, how they're held, how they're kept." He looked at the floor, then back at her. "You operate differently. You've been operating differently since you told me your Florentine was settling, not collapsing. Like there's a version of things that can be repaired and maintained without being controlled." A pause. "I'm aware that's a basic idea that most people arrive at earlier in life." She did smile then, briefly, because she couldn't help it. "You're not most people." "No?" Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Neither are you." They sat in the quiet house for a while longer, and the night moved toward morning the way nights do. Gradually, then suddenly, the dark at the windows going from absolute to merely deep to the first gray suggestion of something else. The months that followed moved in a different grammar entirely. Nathan Pierce's formal indictment came 6 weeks after the night at the estate, drawn from a case file that was, by the time federal prosecutors received it, so comprehensively documented that the proceedings had the quality of a foregone conclusion dressed in legal ceremony. Corruption, conspiracy, organized crime affiliation, breach of federal oath. The charges were read in a courtroom on South Dearborn that Celine did not attend because she had a wedding consultation on the same morning, and she had already given 6 hours of recorded testimony to the task force handling the federal side of the case, and she decided that was enough of her time spent in rooms where Nathan Pierce was the subject. She heard about the sentencing from her attorney, who called at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday while Celine was in the middle of a tasting session for a spring menu she was developing. 17 years. Possibility of reduction for cooperation, which the prosecutor's office expected him to provide fully. She thanked her attorney and ended the call and went back to the tasting, and the sous chef across the table from her, a young woman named Priya who had come on 6 weeks earlier and had the specific intensity of someone who would be running her own kitchen within 5 years, looked at her across the tasting plates and said nothing, because Celine's face said nothing, and Priya was smart enough to read a room. Harvest Catering became something else over those months. Not overnight. Change that is real rarely happens overnight, but through a sequence of deliberate decisions that Celine made with the creative authority that was, as documented by her attorney and signed by both parties, entirely and irrevocably hers. She expanded the pastry program. She hired 3 additional chefs, all of them skilled, none of them hired for ease of management. She turned down 4 corporate bookings that didn't align with the direction she was taking the kitchen's identity and accepted 2 private commissions that paid less but required more, which was her preferred ratio. The culinary incubator program was her idea, and she developed it over 3 months of late nights at the kitchen island that was, by then, increasingly familiar. Not the Pilsen apartment's small table, but the estate kitchen's larger one, where she worked on concept and planning while the house settled around her with its particular quality of enforced quiet, and where Cassian would appear, sometimes at 10, sometimes at midnight, and pour 2 cups of coffee and sit across from her without disrupting the work, unless she wanted disruption. She increasingly wanted disruption. The incubator launched in April. 6 emerging pastry chefs paid apprenticeships, access to the full kitchen operation and equipment, a structured mentorship program built around Celine's own understanding of what she'd needed and not had in her early years. The funding came from Meridian Event Services, which was the holding company that owned Harvest Catering, which was Cassian, but the program's design and operation were hers, and that distinction was not lost on her, and she made sure it was not lost on anyone who asked. Several people asked because the program generated attention of the kind that legitimate excellence generates. Word of mouth from the food industry, a feature in a regional culinary publication, inquiries from 3 other catering operations in Chicago about replicating the model. She gave the interviews herself. In every one of them, she talked about the work. Cassian read every piece. She knew because she occasionally found them on the kitchen island. Not presented, just left, as though placed there by someone who had read them and set them down to attend to something else. She never mentioned that she'd seen them, and neither did he. And that was its own language. The wound in his side healed the way wounds do when they're properly treated and given time, not without leaving evidence, but into something that was simply part of the physical record rather than an ongoing crisis. She saw the scar once, in passing, when he was moving through the kitchen in the early morning before he'd fully assembled the controlled presentation of himself that he carried through his days. He didn't hide it. She didn't comment. They were past the point of performing things for each other, which was its own form of intimacy, and the one she'd found she trusted most. One evening in late May, the kitchen garden that had been dormant and geometrically perfect when she'd arrived in November had come back into season, and she was standing at the window looking at it. The herbs in their beds, the early summer vegetables establishing themselves, the precise order of things that grew, when Cassian came and stood beside her. Not behind her, beside her. At the window, at her shoulder, looking at the same garden. "I don't know what half of these are," he said. "The tall ones at the back are bronze fennel. The low border is thyme," she pointed. "Those are coming up wrong. They're too crowded. Someone planted them in the fall without thinking about spring spread. Can they be saved? If you thin them in the next week, otherwise they'll strangle each other." She looked at him. "I'll do it. I have Saturday free." He looked at the garden, then at her. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She held his eyes. I want to. That's also a thing I'm allowed to have. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said very quietly, Yes, it is. She looked back at the garden, at the too crowded time threatening to strangle itself, and she thought about the woman who had stood in a hotel service corridor 8 months ago, holding a tray of eclair and telling herself that the shortcut through the South Freight elevator was someone else's failure of planning, and how that woman had been right about that, and also had no idea what was standing 2 floors above her. She thought about Nathan's hand on hers across a restaurant table and the 23 weeks of practiced warmth that had constituted the longest performance she'd sat through without knowing she was the audience. She thought about a crystal highball glass in fragments on a table, and the specific terrible quiet of a man saying, whoever claims her, and meaning something he hadn't yet learned to say differently. She thought about cold marble under her palms in a kitchen and a bunker and a study floor, and all the surfaces she'd pressed her hands against across those months to stay anchored while everything else moved. I need to tell you something, she said. He waited. The night I packed my suitcase, the unknown caller, the man you identified as Cask, he told me that what you were doing had nothing to do with protection. She kept her eyes on the garden. He was trying to make me distrust you. I know that's what it was, but what he said had some truth in it, and I've been carrying that truth around for months, and I'd rather put it down. Say it. You didn't keep me close only because I was in danger. She said it evenly. The danger was real, and everything you did to address it was real. But that wasn't all of it. A long pause. The garden was still in the evening light. No, he said. It wasn't all of it. I know. She turned to look at him fully. I'm not angry about it. I want to be clear that I'm not. I'm saying it because I want us to be operating from the same information, because I've had enough of things operating around me that I'm not told about. He met her eyes. You deserve to be told everything. I know I do. She held his gaze. So tell me, all of it, whatever you haven't said. What followed was not a confession in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter and more difficult than that. A man who had built his entire operational existence around the management of information, choosing, methodically and with visible effort, to not manage it. He told her about the moment in the hotel kitchen when he'd seen her fix the collapsed tortillas and understood something about her before he knew her name. He told her about the 6 weeks of knowing Nathan was embedded and making the decision to watch rather than move, and the part of that decision that had nothing to do with operational efficiency. He told her about acquiring the company and the specific moment he'd made that call, and what had been in his mind in that moment that was not professional calculation. He told her these things without packaging them, and she listened without interrupting, and the kitchen garden went from evening light to dusk outside the window while he talked. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The thing you said about protection, she said. What you told me in the bunker. You said it wasn't what I was afraid it was. It wasn't. It was something else. She looked at him. Something you didn't have a clean word for either. No, he said. I didn't. She nodded slowly. She looked at his hands, both of them resting on the window's ledge. The right one that had crushed crystal on a night that felt very far away, and the left one with the thin white scar at the wrist that predated her and that she'd never asked about. She put her hand over the left one.